Hello, everyone. So, I am recording this on the eve of my book launch. Tomorrow, Resilience and Reinvention in a Chaotic World, co authored with Dr. Tamika Sanders, goes into the world. And today, I sat down with the opening chapter of Naeem Akbar's Know Thyself. Now, I was not expecting to be undone by it. And I was not fully undone, but it was more like something clicking into place, like a lock recognizing the key that had always belonged to it. And that's what this episode is about. So, we are 6 episodes into arc 1. We have been naming the distortion, tracking how miseducation operates under psychological conditioning that was installed, what it costs us when we don't know what was done to us. And today, Akbar does something that Woodson set up but didn't fully execute. He names not just what was stolen, but what education was supposed to give us in the first place, because you cannot fully understand the theft if you don't understand what was taken. So let's get into it. So, the word education comes from the Latin educare, to draw forth, to bring out, not to fill, not to install, not to correct, but to draw out what is already present. And Akbar opens this chapter by anchoring the entire conversation in that etymology. And I want you to sit with what that means, because fundamentally, it reframes the crime of miseducation. We tend to talk about miseducation as bad information, incomplete history, propaganda passed off as curriculum. And it is all of those things. But if education is supposed to draw out what is already in you, your identity, your capacity, your vision, the miseducation is not just giving you the wrong content, it is reaching into you and replacing what was there with something else. You are not left empty, you are filled with an alien identity, and it is handed back to you as yourself. And the insidious part of that is the person who has been filled this way often cannot feel the difference. The alien identity does not arrive announcing itself as alien. It arrives as you. It arrives as normal, as natural, as the only available self. And that is what Woodson was naming. And this is what Akbar is now mapping from the inside. So, there are 4 functions that a genuine education must perform, and Akbar lays them out at the start of this chapter and spends the rest of it building the case for each one. And I'm going to walk you through all 4, because once you see them together, the picture of what was deliberately dismantled becomes very hard to look away from. Okay, so before we even got into chapter 1, I was reading the introduction, and Akbar gives the definition of consciousness, literally translated to mean with knowledge or knowing with others. It is the internal manifestation of knowledge. Awareness is the distinguishing quality that differentiates between human life that is functional and life that is dysfunctional. And what it helps me to recognize is we have been living very dysfunctionally. I wasn't today years old when I understood that. But the line landed hard because I didn't need to think about it theoretically. I have spent most of my adult life inside of organizations, relationships, and systems where there was a persistent mismatch between what people said and what they did, between what I was being told was real and what I was actually detecting. And I didn't always have language for it. I knew the feeling of cognitive dissonance before I knew the term, and I'd always experienced it in different forms depending on where I was, who I was around, what role I was in. And there was always this confusion, like, I think I understand what's happening here, but what I'm feeling tells me something different entirely. And I could not always name whether it was safe to even say it out loud. So then I would try to reconcile it internally. And that internal reconciling, it caused its own damage, confusion about what I know, what I understood, who I was, and what I was about. So when when Dr. Akbar says that this awareness is how we determine individual functioning, that consciousness is what makes the difference between a life being lived and a life being performed. I felt that. And then he says this as well. There is a mistaken notion that consciousness is a finite resource, and many people engage in the hoarding of it, operating under the assumption that if others gain awareness, they will become less effective, less necessary, less powerful. And I watched that play out constantly in corporate spaces. Someone who had been doing something for years, now tasked with training someone new, holding that information close because they were afraid of becoming irrelevant. But I never moved that way. It was always strange to me, to be honest, but I understand now that that was not actually a personality quirk. It was a learned survival behavior inside a system that treated knowledge as competitive capital rather than collective inheritance. And when you zoom out, you see that same logic operating at the level of the whole society, the deliberate suppression of history, the defunding of anything that would help people understand themselves and their circumstances, or self knowledge in communities that most need it. And that is institutional hoarding of consciousness. And Dr. Akbar names why. He says, some discovered that other human beings can be subjected and made servile by limiting their consciousness of themselves and by imposing selective aspects of alien knowledge on them instead. And that is the mechanism. Limit what you know about yourself. Replace it with knowledge that serves someone else's interests, and then manage you through that replacement. We are living inside that system right now, a society that is racing toward artificial consciousness while actively expressing the conditions that would allow actual humans to know themselves, grow, and transform. Akbar says consciousness is what it means to be alive, to truly be human. The greater consciousness, the higher the expression of one's humanity. So, what does that say about a society that is working to reduce it? Either they don't want you to be human, or they don't want to be human themselves, or they just aren't human themselves. And I'm going to let you sit with that one. Now, before Akbar gets into the four functions of education, he draws an analogy that I am not going to let pass without naming it directly because it is incendiary in the best way, and I think it's supposed to be. So, he distinguishes an educated being and a trained being. And the trained dog can perform, it can execute commands, it can serve its master with tremendous consistency and reliability, but it can only serve that person who trained it. It cannot take care of itself, it cannot operate independently of the one who conditioned it. And when it responds to the name Spot or Fido, a name given to it by someone else, it is no longer in control of its own fate with a tradition of its own. And the educated being, by contrast, has had something drawn out of them, not installed, but drawn out, their own nature, their own capacity, their own potential, brought into the consciousness and given form. So people who are trained can only serve those who educated their trainers. Like the performing dog, they will only be able to serve their masters and not take care of themselves. And I don't know how many more ways that this needs to be said, but I appreciate that across every text that I'm reading in this arc, okay? The picture, it just keeps getting clearer and more precise. And so that was just in the introduction that came up. So now we're in chapter 1, and Akbar names the first function of a genuine education must and is to provide identity. At birth, he says, our potential to be human is not fully realized. It must be drawn out. Identity is the consciousness of our true nature. And unlike other animals whose nature is preserved in instinct, humans can actually lose their identity if it is never educed. We can be mammals. We can operate in survival mode, in animal-like patterns of conduct. But to be human, to engage in human conduct, requires knowing that you are human. And no civilized group of people leaves that process to chance. And then he goes to naming. And this is probably the earliest, if not the earliest, step in the educational process. He says is in the selection of a name, because within the name is the full range of dimensions of identity: family, language, nationality, culture, history, spiritual and mental qualities that the community intends to cultivate in that person. The name is not just what you are called, it is the first transmission of who you belong to and where you come from, which is exactly why the renaming of enslaved Africans was not incidental to the institution of slavery. It was the institution's first act. Strip the name, sever the transmission, install an alien identity in its place. And now Akbar says the person is identified not as belonging to themselves, but as the property of their master. And I have to be honest with you about what this section activated in me because it is very, very personal. So, my full name is Cheyenne, spelled Chen. Why can't I spell my name? Cheyennnis. My mother created it, and it is a combination of Cheyenne from the Cheyenne people and Wyoming, and Ennis, which I was told is Swahili for Sagittarius. Now, I've never come across another Cheyennis in my life, and I have always loved my name for that. So I decided to look it up in the spirit of Know Thyself, and y'all, I thought that this would finally settle it. Instead, I ended up right back where I started. The origins of Cheyenne are debated, and Ennis does not appear to mean Sagittarius in Swahili the way I was told. But my last name is Doom, and Doom is not my father's name. Doom was the last name of my mother's first husband, a man I have no relation to, never met. And she took that name years before I was even conceived. And the reason she did not give me my father's last name was because, which was Jackson, was because she did not want people to identify my Black ethnicity on job applications and resumes. Now, I was born in the early 80s, and so whatever she was observing in the world in that time told her very clearly, assimilation is how you survive. And so it was encoded into me before I could even speak, not just in the name, but in the language she corrected, the spaces she placed me in, the signals that she sent about what my Blackness meant and what it cost. Don't speak like the other Black children. Don't read as Black before they meet you. Move through the world in a way that is palatable. Signal that you are not like them. 4 decades, 4 decades of mentally deconstructing what that did to what I know about myself, my humanity, my worth, and my inherent value. And I say this not to speak badly of my mother. I say it as an exploration and as an act of knowing myself. Because Akbar says people can only belong to themselves if their identity is an outgrowth of their history, their culture, their reality, and their survival needs. And what I now understand is that my mother was operating from her own fragmented, inherited worldview. She was trying to protect me using the only tool she had been given, the tools that were themselves products of the miseducation she never had the chance to name or properly dismantle. She was making the best decision she knew how to make inside of a system designed to make that decision feel like it was the only option. But it also helps me understand why I have always felt this particular kind of alienness to myself as well as the program. Like, I always felt like there was this curriculum that everyone else had memorized, and I just kept feeling the edges of something that didn't fit. And I think it is because I knew the program was incongruent with who I actually was, but I didn't want to run it. but I wasn't shown any other way. So I just tried to comply, and the compliance caused its own damage. Miseducation, Akbar says, begins at the level where a person is taught an alien identity and nothing about their true one. They learn to see themselves as players, as someone in someone else's story. They do not learn their own. And that is what was handed to me. And this arc, this entire series is the process of finding my own way, my way back to my own story. And the good news, and there is good news, is that I am remembering. Here I am, still growing, still developing, and still ascending. Here I am coming to the knowledge that I already knew, but it just wasn't cultivated. And here I am standing on the eve of my book launch, a book about returning to yourself, reading a text that is naming the exact contours of the path that I've already been walking. And the work has always, it was always in me. The education is just finally catching up. And that is just so, 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 so exciting. And so now I want to get into this next very, very um, important function of genuine education. And that is transmitting the legacy of competence. Now, this grabbed me because the transmission of a legacy of competence. So every people has a record of achievement, discoveries, mastery, breakthroughs, things that were accomplished before anyone currently alive was born, and that belong in the living as inheritance. So the function of education is to transmit that record to a new generation, not just as historical information, but as a proof of capability, as the message. People who look like you have done extraordinary things. That means you have that in you too. That means the standard of greatness was set by and for you. And Akbar makes the point very plainly. The reason European American educational systems center European heroes is not incidental. It is not arrogance for its own sake, it is infrastructure. It is the mechanism by which each generation is given the image of itself as its greatness and is therefore expected to become great. You know, the whole make America great again. So from Santa Claus to Einstein, from George Washington to Neil Armstrong, the European American child is swimming in reflections of their own legacy presented as the universal standard. And then some critics turn around and call Afrocentric education when we turn around to try to do the same thing as feel-good curriculum. So think about that. The same educational system that has spent centuries telling European American children elaborate, selective, and in many cases, outright dishonest stories about their ancestors, including men who owned other human beings, who massacred indigenous people, who built their empires on the labor of the enslaved. That system calls the teaching of actual African and African American achievement a feel-good curriculum. So the accusation only works if you have already decided that centering Black achievement is optional while centering European achievement as neutral. Hint, it is not neutral. It never has been. It is a mechanism of power, and it works, unfortunately. Now, here's the part that cuts the deepest. Those who break through anyway, those who achieve something real within a miseducated system, often credit the legacy of others for their own accomplishments. And not because they're dishonest, not because they're ungrateful, because they genuinely do not know the legacy that belongs to them. They were never given it, so they reach for the only legacy that they were taught, which is to recognize as credible. And then they say, I learned from them. I was shaped from them. I owe what I am to them. Michael Jackson actually did this with Fred Astaire when, he innovated the moonwalk. And in a way, they are telling the truth because that is the only inheritance that they were handed. The other one was kept from them. If you can't see it, You cannot be it. And if you never see people who look like you leading, achieving, discovering, governing on their own terms, then your vision of what is possible for you is going to be constrained by that absence. The continued underrepresentation of Black people in leadership and authority and power in this country is not just a justice issue, it is an ongoing interruption of the transmission of the legacy of competence. Every generation that grows up without those images is a generation that has been cut off from their own inheritance. So that was the second function of genuine education. The third function is this is the one that made me go still. So Akbar uses a biological analogy. We know that people who survive exposure to certain diseases develop immunity, and that immunity can be transmitted through blood, through the mother's milk, through the body's memory of survival. The same principle applies to education. A genuine education transmits the acquired immunities of previous generations. Isn't that cool? So the hard-won knowledge of how to survive specific threats, specific systems, and specific forms of attack are covered in that. Every society builds some version of this transmission. Ethics, law, community rituals, these are all mechanisms for passing down what a people has learned about how to protect itself. Some of those mechanisms are just, some of them are not, but all of them serve the function of telling the living, here is what your people have learned. Here is what has happened when we didn't know this, and here is how you protect yourselves. And for African Americans, Dr. Akbar names the immune record, the immune record explicitly. Cinque and the Amistad, Nat Turner, Denmark, Vesey, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, the Ashanti of Ghana, who outmaneuvered the British when they came to steal the sacred symbols of their sovereignty, Marcus Garvey, Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X, Paul Robeson, Dubois Woodson, the list goes on. These are not inspirational figures in the feel-good sense, but they are the record of strategies that worked. They are the evidence that resistance was possible, that it happened, and that our people found ways through what was designed to be inescapable. Teaching those stories is not about making children feel good. It is about giving them the immune knowledge that their survival may depend on. And the educational system that refuses to teach them is not being neutral. It is performing surgery. It is removing the immune system and leaving the body exposed. And then when the body gets sick, calling the sickness a character defect. And Akbar makes the point that has stayed with me the most. Those who carry the cure are accused of carrying the infection. And I connect this to drapetomania, which was a diagnosis invented in 1851 by a physician named Samuel Cartwright to pathologize enslaved Africans who tried to escape. The desire for freedom was classified as a mental illness, and the people naming the disease were the ones causing it. The people trying to heal from it were being called the problem. And we are living in a direct continuation of that pattern right now. I recorded this on this, within days of depositions that were being conducted by very young white men who had no business in the positions that they were operating under within Doge, using AI to filter out language that they deemed dangerous to their cause. And when you do a little digging, the cause becomes so self-evident. Programs serving communities that have been harmed by centuries of state-sanctioned violence were having their funding stripped. And the people calling that equity programming, calling the transmission of immunity to oppression is considered a threat to American values. So it's the same logic, a different century, but the same immunity is being blocked. And Akbar also names something that I want to make sure does not get glossed over: the ritual dimension of immunity. So traditional African societies had structured elder-guided rites of passage for young people moving from childhood into adulthood. Now, these were not ceremonies for ceremony's sake. They were systematic immunizations against the confusion that comes when youth are trying to become adults without proper guidance. The rebellion, the crisis, the dangerous decision making, it was addressed, it was contained, it was transformed into something purposeful by people who had been trained to hold that process. The confusion, the violence, the early death that takes our young people in disproportionate numbers, that is not a cultural failure. That is what happens when the immune system has been surgically removed and the people are then blamed for that infection. And Dr. Woodson got into that in the miseducation of the Negro, in how there would be this practice of separating the young babies of enslaved African mothers because of that empathy connection. But I'm going to get into the closing of chapter 1, which is the fourth function, which is the development of a shared vision. Now, a shared vision is not a mission statement, and it damn sure isn't a slogan. It is a collective image that a people holds of who they are and where they are going. The understanding of their common destiny that shapes how individuals within the community see themselves in relation to each other and to the world. And he is very clear that this is not a communist vision, not the sacrifice of the individual for the state. I see it as closer to Ubuntu. I am because we are. The individual achieves their greatest expression as a part of a community of excellence. The community has no higher significance than the dignity and the contribution of each person within it. Neither rises without the other, which is why you hear people say none of us is free until we are all free. And he makes the point that African Americans have been placed in a particular and painful relationship to the American national vision. Conspicuously absent from its formulation, consistently subjected to its contradictions, and still expected to celebrate it. We were never asked what we believed freedom was for. We were handed someone else's definition and told to be grateful. The African vision Akbar articulates is not about imitating American individual with black faces. It is a vision grounded in self-determination, control of resources, participation in decision-making on our own terms, material prosperity as a floor rather than a ceiling, and the elevation of spiritual and moral life as the actual goal. And then he says something that kind of landed like a door opening. Certainly, a civilized people would not aspire to imitate this level of human exploitation that we have come to see, but certainly one would want an education that equips them to protect themselves from such barbaric destruction. Now, that's a bar, okay? We are not trying to become our oppressors. We are trying to build an education that ensures we can never be consumed by them again. And this is where the chapter did something for me that I had not anticipated. So I finished graduate school studying industrial organizational psychology. My treatise is called The Performance of Civility, Exiting Stage Left. And what I have been circling in with that work is the question of why American institutions so consistently state one set of values, but they operate by another. And it's been snapped into focus while reading this chapter. So the gap between stated values and enacted behavior in this country is not a failure of implementation. It is actually constitutional inheritance. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Now, that sentence was written by a man who owned and enslaved people, who also happens to be my fifth great grandfather. But it was ratified by men who built this nation on their bodies. And what that founding document established quietly, durably, and structurally was that an institution could proclaim its highest ideals while actively violating them, and no one was empowered to check them on it. That was the first codified example of American organizations saying one thing and doing another as a design feature rather than a flaw. So every company that posts its values on the wall and then produces outcomes that contradict every one of them downstream of that document is in violation of that. Every organization that claims equity and enforces hierarchy, that claims community and it extracts from it, that claims human dignity and then disappears people, they are all operating within a template that was set in 1776. And that is what I'm trying to do with Culture Roots, something that I am building, which is an organizational diagnostic tool, which is a holistic instrument for measuring the gap between what institutions claim to value and what their behavioral patterns actually produce, and then asking, are we willing to build something that actually closes that distance? And so, what I understood sitting with this chapter is that what I'm building is an application of that fourth function of education. It is the shared vision function, made structural and measurable and brought into life in many facets, because I know it's going to expand organizational life. So I would ask, what would it look like for us to actually transmit competence, actually cultivate identity, to actually immunize our people against the social diseases that are embedded within it? Now, the work is already in me. Akbar's chapter 1 of this book gave me the framework to see it more clearly than I had before. And while time did not permit me being able to finish this entire book in time for this exercise, this episode, so I want to leave you with this: identity, competence, immunity, shared vision. These are the four. These are the four things that an educational system was always supposed to give us. Each one was deliberately interrupted. Each one, though, is recoverable. And Akbar closes this chapter with something I want to sit with for a moment. The opportunity for African Americans to be truly human, to exercise our full capacity as human beings, can only occur when we have an educational philosophy and system that transmits those four qualities. Not a curriculum that fills the gaps, not performance on someone else's standard or standards, but the real thing. That is the work. That is what this arc is building toward, and we are still in it. And now that we have come to better see that there is distortion, next week we begin the excavation of who architected this distortion and why with Urugu. So this has been We've Been New, and I'm going to see you next time officially as a published author myself.